Hello everyone and welcome to another video. In this one I'll be analyzing the front line around Bakhmut with a focus on Soledar and Klischiivka. Starting out in the Solidar area, if we look at the map here, we can see that the Russians have recently conducted a breakthrough within the city of Solidar, where they've reached the outskirts of Bakhmut to the south, as well as the rail lines in the center of Solidar, and finally they have reached the outskirts of Solidar from the east. What exactly does this mean? Starting out in the Bakhmutska area, we can see that this is a warehouse-ish area where there's a lot of supplies stashed. However, most likely considering the fighting has been going on at Bakhmutska for a long time, and this area has most likely been shelled a lot, there's probably not much left. With that in mind, there is probably a few they can stay and fight in for a while. However, most likely this will fall very soon, as it's not a very significant area to defend. And that's the fall of Bakhmutske. Moving on to Solidar itself, we can see that the fighting is ongoing specifically around the center of the city. Now, the Ukrainians have already prepared a defense of this northern part of Solidar, as they have the height advantage in the direction of the south, as this whole area to the north is on the high ground. However, compared to this eastern part where the Russians have recently captured, this is actually the low ground and this is the high ground. With that in mind, the Russian forces who have now moved to the eastern outskirts of Solidar can now outflank the Ukrainian positions and attack them from behind, leaving them vulnerable, as the Russians will have the high ground to the north and the east, negating their advantage by holding this position, meaning that they will either hold their ground in the north and fight the Russians to the east, or they will pull back to this defensive line to the west of Solidar, leaving behind Solidar, as it will be difficult for them to hold onto it for much longer, especially without receiving much reinforcements. They will need a lot of reinforcements to push back the Russians from this open field to the north, or otherwise they will be in a very disastrous position within Solidar, as Russians can advance from the south and the east at the same time. The rapid advance of Russian forces within Solidar most likely points towards the Ukrainian defenders actually pulling back to this defensive position and fighting within there rather than at the low ground, where they would not have any advantage within Solidar. So they've moved to their most advantageous position, but this position is also disadvantageous considering the Russians have advanced from the east. That's it for Solidar. If we then look south of Solidar to the open field, which we can see here, the fall of Bakhmutske will allow the Russian forces to advance towards Solidar from the south, outflanking the Ukrainian positions from this direction as well, but it also allows them to advance towards Krasnahora as well as Blahodatne. We've already seen the Russian forces advance towards Krasnahora, which, comparing this to Soledar or Klischiivka, is a much more unfavorable position. We also see from this perspective that the high ground is to the east. If we look at the topographic map, Krasnahora is also located within a valley, and to the east of it there's the high ground. This is 180 meters and this is somewhere around 100 meters. So with this we know that the Russians are fighting a downhill battle to every direction now that they have captured. With the capture of Blahodatne, they'll be able to push throughout this whole open field and attack the villages that are located downhill, specifically Krasnahora, Blahodatne, and Solidar to the north. With this, we can say that the recent Russian advance in Solidar is very significant, and the Ukrainian defensive abilities around this area has significantly weakened. However, what specifically does Solidar mean for this front line? If you look at this location, the Siversk-Bakhmut line, which is the current Ukrainian defensive line in the Donbass region, we see that it goes from the north to the south, from Siversk to Bakhmut, and it passes through Solidar from the west through the highway. With the recent Russian advance, and if they manage to capture Solidar, then they'll be able to cut off this road, cutting a hole within the defensive line of the Ukrainians. With this, they'll be able to cut off the last highway that goes to Siversk. The other one is this one to the northwest that goes through the Severodonetsk River. However, the bridge here has blown up and it hasn't been repaired since, as far as I know. With that, there will be no highway going to Siversk. There will be 2 normal roads. However, the highway will be completely cut off. At the same time, they will also be able to cut off this road northwest of Bakhmut, which will cut off one of 2 highways that goes to Bakhmut. So with the loss of Siversk, the Russians will be able to cut off the northern supply lines to both Bakhmut and the southern supply lines to Siversk, which will significantly reduce the amount of supplies that can be sent to these cities. This will also severely weaken the defensive positions of the Ukrainians by the Bilohorivka Spirne Vesele line, which means that they will most likely be forced to pull back to the Siversk line and create a defensive line here to the north, or even pull further back to the highway going between Sloviansk and Bakhmut. And this force will most likely be used to break through the Russian positions and possibly push back the Russian forces in Soledar as they give up the northern area, as Solidar is actually more important than Siversk, because the loss of Siversk will lose them this enclave here. The loss of Solidar will be very risky for Bakhmut, and Bakhmut is more important than Siversk, because with the loss of Bakhmut, Siversk will inevitably be next. Now, in the situation that Solidar has been lost and what I say become true, the Russians capture Krasnohora, Pitvorodne, Blahodatne and cut off the northern road to Bakhmut, the most definite next target for Russia will be Klischiivka. Looking at Klischiivka, we can see here that there are 2 significant defensive positions outside of Klischiivka and then Klischiivka itself. Then we have the canal to the east. First, looking at the defensive positions, we have this trench network to the southwest of Klischiivka and to the north of Klischiivka. We can see that this one is much larger and is connected to the road, which is the main supply line to Klischiivka. And then we have this one to the west, which is the flank of Klischiivka, which will allow the Ukrainians to protect the western flank of Klischiivka and prevent the Russians from encircling it. And the northern one is to protect this main supply route to Klischiivka. So, with this knowledge, we know that the Russians will have a hard time assaulting the west of Klischiivka, as the Ukrainians have their trench network, and at the same time they'll have a hard time surrounding Klischiivka because of the trench network to the north of Klischiivka. And at the same time, the east of Klischiivka is also difficult, as although this is a hill and capturing it would give the Russians a major advantage, we know that there is the canal to the east of this, which will make it difficult for the Russians to advance towards the hills. And even if they manage to capture the hills, then they will have the difficulty of attacking Klischiivka itself. Although they will have the high ground, as this is a hill, they will have to push through the Ukrainian defensive positions within Klischiivka while fighting in an open area. So they will have no cover, and at the same time the Ukrainians will have a lot of cover. And this is paired with the fact Ukraine has a lot of anti-tank weapons, so they can't just walk in with their tanks as cover, as they will most likely be destroyed. This leaves the Russians with one option, and that is to completely destroy Klischiivka with artillery and aircraft, as they have done in other areas. However, Klischiivka itself is not the largest city. However, the Russians can use the same tactic towards the 2 trench networks that the Ukrainians have to defend. So most likely we'll see them pull up their artillery and shoot at these positions, which is the 2 trench networks and Klischiivka, and try to completely destroy the Ukrainian positions without nearing them. At the same time, we may see the Russian forces try to reach the highway between Bakhmut and Ivanivske. Of course, this will also be risky, as the Ukrainian positions can fire at this advance from the north, from inside Bakhmut. However, if the Russians start by attacking Bakhmut from the south, which we're seeing them do, then they'll be able to cover for this advance, and then they can build up a base by the outskirts of Bakhmut. So most likely what we will see is a Russian undercut from the south of Bakhmut, trying to reach the highway and cut it off. If not reaching it, then create a position to the east of it, where they will have fire control over the road. Then the Ukrainians would be left with only a singular road, and that's one road they will be able to resupply and send reinforcements to Bakhmut while going around the Russian forces. However, with the loss of the northern area, we will see the Russians most likely try to completely encircle by attacking Berhivka and Yahidne and then moving westwards. So they will try to push westwards, however that would leave them vulnerable from the north. But if they manage to capture Soledar, then they will be able to hold that as a defensive position, cut off the main highway and continue their attacks by pushing northwards and westwards, by going to Yasukivka as well as Selizhnyanske, and create a defensive line to the north, which will allow them to push westwards and southwards and completely encircle Bakhmut. So essentially what I'm saying is that the most important city outside of Bakhmut in this front line is Solidar, as it allows them to completely shape the battlefield to the north, and at the same time Klischiivka is very well defended and it was very difficult for the Russians to take, so it will most likely try to go around it, as that is much easier for them. And that's going to be all for my analysis. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.